My life in a quiet suburban neighborhood was peaceful, until the HOA turned it into a nightmare. It all started with a simple security gate I installed to protect my home and my daughter, Sarah. After a string of burglaries in our area, I wasn't willing to take any chances. The Wilsons had been robbed while their kids were home. The Martinez family woke up to an intruder inside their house. Even elderly Mrs. Jackson wasn't spared. I checked the HOA rules before installing the gate. It was a simple black iron design that blended with the house. Nothing extravagant. But just 3 days after installation, Karen Thompson, the newest and most self-important HOA board member, arrived at my doorstep. Dressed in her usual tennis outfit, she stood with her arms crossed and declared, "That gate has to go." When I tried to explain, she cut me off. "I'm on the HOA board now, and we won't allow this." That night, I found my first violation notice taped to the gate. The next morning, Karen was outside taking pictures of my house. What I didn't know was that this was just the beginning of a battle that would shake the entire HOA to its core. At first, I thought it was just Karen being difficult. After all, she had installed bright purple shutters on her house last spring without approval. Why was she suddenly enforcing the rules so strictly? But then, things escalated. Over the next few days, I noticed Karen constantly watching my house. At 7 a.m., she was outside taking pictures from every angle. My mailbox, my flower beds, my gate. That same day, I received another violation notice. This time, a $100 daily fine for unauthorized modifications. I wasn't the only target. My neighbors started complaining that they too were receiving citations for ridiculous things. Mrs. Rodriguez got fined for having unapproved flower colors. The Petersons received a warning for their excessive bird feeder height. Each complaint led back to Karen. It was as if she had declared herself queen of the HOA and was ruling by intimidation. But what really pushed me over the edge was how it affected Sarah. One night, she came home from school looking crushed. "Mom," she whispered, "Karen's daughter told everyone our house is bringing down property values. Is that why Tommy didn't invite me to his birthday party?" That was when I knew this wasn't just about my gate anymore. I stayed up late that night reviewing HOA documents, trying to understand how Karen had gained so much power so quickly. That's when I found something odd. Karen had only been appointed to the board 2 weeks ago, filling a vacancy left by someone who moved away. She hadn't even been officially approved yet. And that wasn't all. I started digging through the HOA's financial records. Something felt off. The board had suddenly started paying for emergency property consultations right after Karen joined. The amount seemed excessive for such a small community. Then, a new text message appeared on my phone. "Remove the gate by morning, or we remove it for you." I saved the message as evidence and went to bed. If they wanted a fight, I was ready. What Karen and the rest of the HOA didn't realize was that they had just picked a battle with the wrong homeowner. Because what they still didn't know? I wasn't just another resident. I was the state senator in charge of housing regulations. At 6:15 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of heavy machinery. "Dad, there are bulldozers outside," Sarah shouted, her voice full of panic. I threw on my robe and rushed downstairs, my heart pounding. As I flung open the front door, the morning air was still cool, but the scene before me made my blood boil. 3 construction vehicles were parked on my lawn, their yellow warning lights flashing. And there, standing smugly in her tennis outfit, phone held high to record everything, was Karen. "Stop this right now!" I yelled, stepping onto my porch barefoot. The construction workers hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances, but Karen was quick to take control. "Don't stop!" she snapped. "This is an HOA-sanctioned demolition. We have every right." Behind her, HOA President Richard Walsh waved a stack of papers in the air. "Judge Harrison signed this emergency injunction yesterday," he said, looking pleased with himself. "Your gate is an immediate threat to community standards." I grabbed the document, scanning it quickly. And that's when I saw it. They had gone to court behind my back. They never notified me, never gave me a chance to respond. They planned this ambush knowing I wouldn't be able to stop it in time. Karen smirked as she turned to the growing crowd of neighbors. This is what happens when people don't respect community guidelines. Then, with a loud metallic screech, the demolition crew ripped my gate from its hinges. My daughter gasped beside me as we watched $23,000 worth of my property being destroyed. And they didn't stop there. My front wall, my carefully tended flower beds, the security system I had installed to keep my daughter safe. The bulldozers crushed everything. I forced myself to stay calm, recording every second with my phone. Through the lens, I saw something that made my anger rise even further. The demolition crew had crossed my property line. They weren't just tearing down the gate. They were destroying parts of my home that weren't even included in their so-called injunction. That was their biggest mistake. I turned to Karen and Richard, who were still reveling in their power trip. I wanted to tell them right then who I really was. That I had spent years writing the very housing laws they were violating. But no, timing was everything. Instead, I simply smiled. Let them dig their own graves. Because what they didn't know was that by tomorrow morning, they wouldn't just be dealing with an angry homeowner. They'd be dealing with the state senator who had the power to change the very laws they thought they could abuse. As the dust settled and pieces of my front wall lay shattered across my lawn, I stood there, barefoot, robe-clad, and furious, but not defeated. Karen was still grinning, holding up her phone as if she had just won some great battle. Richard stood beside her, arms crossed, looking smug. They thought they had beaten me, but they had no idea what was coming next. I turned my gaze toward the demolition crew chief, a middle-aged man who looked uncomfortable as his team packed up their equipment. His hard hat bore a familiar logo, Walsh Construction. I smirked. Of course. Richard's own company had been awarded the contract to demolish my gate. That meant a massive conflict of interest, one that could be legally challenged. I kept my phone steady, recording every moment, every name, every action. This wasn't just a petty HOA dispute anymore. This was something bigger, and I wasn't the only one who saw it. The neighbors, some still in their pajamas, stood on their porches, watching with concerned expressions. Some were filming, others were whispering to each other. For the first time, I saw hesitation in their faces. Karen must have noticed it too, because she spoke louder, her voice tinged with false confidence. "This is what happens when people think they're above the rules," she called out, gesturing toward my destroyed property. "The HOA exists to protect our home values." But her words didn't have the same effect as before. That's when Sarah, my teenage daughter, stepped forward. Her voice was soft but strong. "Justice?" she asked, looking straight at Karen. "You're destroying our home because you don't like how it looks." Karen's smirk faltered. Some neighbors shifted uncomfortably. The construction workers slowed, unsure if they wanted to be part of this anymore. And then, in the middle of it all, my phone buzzed. A message from my assistant at the state capitol. "Senator, local news has picked up the story. Do you want to comment?" I nearly laughed. Perfect. I took a deep breath, centering myself. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't about anger. This was about power, real power. And Karen and Richard? They had just handed me all the ammunition I needed. I turned to Sarah, squeezing her shoulder. "Sweetheart, don't worry. Sometimes you have to lose a battle to win the war." Tomorrow morning, the HOA board meeting was scheduled. What Karen and Richard didn't know? That same morning, I would be officially announcing my new position as chair of the State Housing Committee. Their little neighborhood power trip was about to become the biggest mistake of their lives. By the next morning, my face was all over the news. Reporters had picked up the story of the HOA bulldozing a homeowner's property over a gate dispute, and they had no idea that homeowner was a state senator. I walked into the HOA board meeting calm and composed, while Karen and Richard sat at the front, completely unaware of what was about to happen. The room was packed, not just with HOA members, but with neighbors, reporters, and even a few state investigators I had quietly invited. Richard, ever the confident HOA president, cleared his throat. "First order of business, violations and community standards enforcement." I smiled. "Actually, I'd like to discuss something first." Karen huffed. "This meeting is for HOA members only." I pulled a certified letter from my briefcase and placed it on the table. "Oh, don't worry, Karen. This letter is from my office. As of this morning, I am officially chair of the State Housing Committee, which means we are now reviewing all HOA policies, including this one." Karen's face drained of color. Richard shifted in his seat. This isn't the right venue for that discussion." I raised an eyebrow. "Not the right venue?" "Because it was the right venue when you and Karen went behind my back and pushed through an illegal demolition order." The room fell silent. One of the state investigators stood up, flipping through a folder. "Since we're here, let's discuss some irregularities, like how HOA funds were being paid to a construction company owned by Richard Walsh's brother-in-law, or how some board members received automatic approvals for home modifications, while others were fined excessively for minor infractions." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish. That's just a coincidence," the investigator continued. "Coincidence? Because we also found that HOA fines disproportionately targeted homeowners who challenged board decisions, while friends of board members, including Karen herself, were allowed unapproved home modifications." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Then Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly woman Karen had threatened into signing the petition against me, stood up. I was too scared to say anything before, but Karen made me sign that petition against Senator Mitchell. She said if I didn't, I'd start getting violation notices. And guess what? My fence was suddenly too tall the next day. Other neighbors nodded in agreement. Karen was panicking now. "This is all a misunderstanding." I calmly set my phone on the table and played a recording of Karen's voice. "If they don't take that gate down, we'll just do it for them. It's an eyesore, and I don't care if we have to find something in the rules to justify it." Silence. I leaned forward. "Karen, Richard, you've spent months bending the rules to benefit yourselves. But today, the rules are bending against you." Karen sat frozen, her fingers gripping the edges of the table so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Richard looked even worse, sweat pooling at his collar as the weight of the situation finally settled in. They were caught. I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady. "For months, you've weaponized HOA rules against homeowners, but the moment those same rules apply to you, you act like it's unfair." I turned toward the crowd. "That ends today." Neighbors murmured in agreement. The power dynamic had shifted. Just then, my assistant walked into the room, carrying a thick folder of documents. Senator, we just received additional findings from the state's ethics committee. I nodded. Perfect timing. I took the folder and flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning the contents before addressing the room. It turns out the HOA didn't just violate my rights. They've been running an entire system of selective enforcement and financial fraud. I held up a bank statement. Here's an interesting one. Monthly HOA emergency funds paid directly to a shell company owned by Richard Walsh's wife. Thousands of dollars. And yet, we were told those funds were for neighborhood improvements. Gasps filled the room. One of the reporters scribbled furiously in his notebook. This was bigger than just a personal vendetta. This was corruption. Karen shot to her feet. This is ridiculous. You can't just accuse us of crimes. I smirked. I'm not accusing you, Karen. The state investigators are, and so is the Attorney General, who I just got off the phone with this morning. Richard swallowed hard. This is an internal matter. We can handle it within the HOA. I shook my head. No, Richard. You lost that privilege when you bulldozed my property without due process. I turned to the state investigator. Would you like to explain the legal consequences of HOA fraud and property destruction? The investigator stood up, adjusting his tie. Absolutely. Under state law, these violations carry hefty fines, restitution requirements, and in some cases, criminal charges. He turned toward Karen and Richard. You may want to hire a lawyer. Karen finally realized what was happening. She wasn't in control anymore. For the first time, she looked scared. Richard slumped back into his chair. He knew it was over. Then, from the back of the room, a voice called out. I move to remove Karen and Richard from the HOA board, effective immediately. I looked up, surprised. It was Mrs. Rodriguez. A second later, another neighbor raised their hand. I second the motion. The vote was unanimous. Karen and Richard had spent months bullying others. Now they were the ones being kicked out. I looked at my daughter, standing beside me. She wasn't scared anymore. She was proud. Karen and Richard stormed out of the meeting, their faces red with humiliation. Cameras followed their every move, reporters throwing questions at them. Do you have any response to the fraud allegations? Mr. Walsh, will you resign from the HOA entirely? But they didn't answer, because they knew the damage was done. I exhaled slowly, watching as the meeting officially adjourned. The neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak up were now standing together, talking, exchanging stories, and for the first time in a long time, feeling like they had a voice. Sarah tugged my sleeve. Mom, does this mean it's over? I smiled, squeezing her hand. For Karen and Richard? Yes, but for us, this is just the beginning. Because the battle wasn't just about my security gate anymore. It was about every homeowner who had ever been bullied by an overreaching HOA. The next morning, I arrived at the state capitol for an emergency housing committee hearing. The room was packed. News stations had picked up my story, and now homeowners from across the state were coming forward with their own HOA horror stories. One by one, people stood up to speak. An elderly veteran who had been fined for installing a wheelchair ramp, a single mom whose children's treehouse had been torn down while they were at school, a family who had been pushed out of their home by endless fines, all because they had painted their front door the wrong shade of blue. Each story made my resolve stronger. When it was my turn to speak, I held up a photo of my demolished gate. This isn't just my story, I said, my voice steady. It's happening all over the state. HOAs were created to protect homeowners, not to punish them. But right now, too many are abusing their power. That ends today. I turned toward my fellow lawmakers. Today, I am introducing the Homeowner Protection Act, a bill designed to prevent selective enforcement, illegal demolitions, and conflicts of interest within HOA boards. It would require clear rules, real appeals processes, and oversight to stop abuse before it started. The vote was unanimous. The bill passed. HOAs across the state would now be held accountable. No more unchecked power. No more bullying. That evening, I stood by my newly rebuilt security gate watching as Karen's moving trucks pulled away from the neighborhood. The same HOA rules she had used to control others were now forcing her to leave. Sarah laughed beside me. "Mom, remember when she told everyone we were the troublemakers?" I nodded. "Yeah, and now look who's leaving." Because in the end, bullies always lose. And this time, the rules had finally been rewritten for good. Power, when unchecked, leads to corruption. Karen and Richard believed they could bend the rules to their advantage, weaponizing the HOA to control and intimidate others. But in their arrogance, they forgot one critical truth: justice always catches up. This story isn't just about a gate or an unfair HOA. It's about standing up against abuse, even when the odds seem stacked against you. Bullies thrive on fear, but the moment people start speaking out, their power crumbles. I could have backed down, removed my gate, and let them win. But doing that wouldn't have just hurt my family. It would have sent a message that their behavior was acceptable. So instead, I fought back. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with knowledge, strategy, and the law. And in the end, they lost everything. Because power doesn't belong to those who demand it. It belongs to those who use it to protect others. HOA abuse isn't just fiction. It's a real problem affecting thousands of homeowners. Across the country, people have faced outrageous fines, selective enforcement, and even illegal demolitions just because a board member didn't like their choice of paint color or landscaping. That's why laws like the Homeowner Protection Act matter. They create transparency, limit HOA power, and protect homeowners from abuse. If you're dealing with an overreaching HOA, document everything, learn your rights, and don't be afraid to fight back. And most importantly, support legislation that holds HOAs accountable. Because when communities stand together, no bully, no matter how powerful, can win.